All right, welcome folks. Those of you joining, we'll give a couple minutes for people to trickle in and then we'll get going. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let's kick this off. Welcome to today's Local Motion Learning Network event. I'm Jonathan Weber. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Complete Streets Program Manager here at Local Motion. I think most of you probably know about us, but Local Motion's mission is to make it safe, accessible, and fun for everyone to bike, walk, and roll in Vermont. We're going to keep everyone muted through this first part of the webinar, but there are going to be opportunities to engage in the chat, and feel free to drop questions that you have into the chat throughout, and we'll field them either during the webinar or hold them till the end. And then we're going to have a discussion section at the end, and if you want to make a comment at that point, please just raise your hand and we will give you the ability to speak if you would like to, but you're also welcome to comment in the chat at that point as well. If you've got any technical issues, you can send them directly to me through the question box, or contact me at jonathan@localmotion.org, and I will post that in the chat in just a minute here. We are recording today, and the recording will be up on our website within the next few business days. And you're welcome, of course, to share that with whoever you think is interested. So let's get started. Today's presentation and our discussion is really focused on laws affecting biking, walking, and rolling in Vermont and how we might improve them. We have two presenters today, Mary Catherine Graziano and John Kaplan. Mary Catherine is the Senior Manager of Education and Safety for Local Motion. In this role, she manages multiple projects related to outreach and training for adults and children, with a focus on bicycle and pedestrian safety, skills, education, and community engagement. Her work to support schools, communities, and local organizations in promoting walking and biking have given Local Motion's many partners the resources they need to make active transportation and recreation safe and enjoyable for Vermonters. John Kaplan has been the bicycle and pedestrian coordinator at VTrans since 2009, and he's worked in the program since 2000. John is involved with project funding and development, policy, technical assistance, safety education, and promotion of bicycling and walking. He recently moved to the Operations and Safety Bureau, where he continues with a bicycle and pedestrian focus within the larger context of traffic engineering. He's been involved with bicycle and pedestrian planning and design since 1993. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Catherine and John to kick off the presentation.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We're very excited about this workshop. And if you have any questions, just ask them in the chat, like Jonathan said. And if you need closed captioning, you can turn it on. It's called live transcript. So if you need that, you can turn it on. And today we are excited to talk about making walking and biking laws pertain to the real world and how they interact with us in our daily lives. And I'm going to turn this right over to John.
All right. Thanks, Mary Catherine, and welcome everyone. So yeah, Mary Catherine and I did this same session essentially at the Walk Bike Summit in May in Middlebury, and it was a very lively discussion. So hopefully we'll have more of that today. So this is our agenda. We're just doing the intro now, and then we're going to have a quick, not necessarily a poll, but chance for you to ask some kind of burning questions, and then get into why the laws around walking and biking matter, a little bit of the history of laws and how some of them favor drivers over pedestrians or bicyclists, And of course, we will be talking about the existing Vermont laws around walking and biking, and then talk a little bit about some possible changes or ideas, examples from other states, and then hopefully have plenty of time for discussion and answering questions. So next slide. So one thing we wanted to just sort of put out there is that I like this graphic in terms of, what is effective at, or where do laws fit in terms of keeping people safe. So if you think about sort of the interaction of, large, heavy vehicles and vulnerable users like people walking and biking, ideally, or the best way to keep everyone safe or keep the vulnerable users safe is to not have interactions between those two entities at all. And then kind of, so that's kind of at the top, like eliminate that hazard completely. There are some ways to, kind of moving down the scale here, to things that are less effective, are things like, designing streets so that there's, separation between vulnerable users and cars, reducing the speed of cars, because speed is a big factor in safety. And then there is behavior change, doing things with education. And this is where I would say laws fall in, is in the behavior side. So, and then kind of at the bottom are things like helmets, reflective vests. So just wanted to kind of set a context for this. So we're talking about laws, but, and they are important, but really there's a lot we can do with infrastructure to keep everybody safe on the roads. All
So,
right. Yep.
yeah.
Back.
First of all, I just want to say that neither John nor I are lawyers, so we can't get into the legal aspects of this. So the framing of this presentation is going to be more around how the laws themselves are, in a broader context, challenging for those of us who use our roadways. So, but before we start our presentation, we want to hear from you. So write in the text box here, in the chat, the questions you came to this presentation with, what laws you have been really thinking about would make your experience as a person walking or biking better and safer, existing laws that you would like to see change, and any challenges you've personally experienced with existing laws. I know we're going to show some examples of places where the law interacts with infrastructure in a way that makes it impossible to be safe and follow the law. So we'll take a few minutes for folks to add their ideas and comments and questions and things they're hoping to learn here. So I can talk while folks are thinking. So for example, for me, I have experienced issues with following the law when it is unsafe for me to do so. So for example, riding as far to the right as possible is really excellent unless it puts me in a situation where I'm going to be unsafe or that I'm not given space as a road user. So at a four-way stop, I don't stay far to the right. I go into the intersection, I filter in. I don't cut cars, I filter in, but I get into the intersection, into the center of the lane so that I become part of lane traffic so that I can actually make it through a four-way stop intersection, because if I don't, I have found that I will sit there at a stop sign unable to go forward safely because all the motor vehicles are giving themselves turns and not me. So we're starting to see some really great questions in here. Now you are allowed to take the lane if it is unsafe. to be as far to the right as possible. So in my four-way stop situation, it isn't technically illegal, but it can be a little gray area-ish. So right now we're seeing from Charlie Jones, bike laws parallel those in place for vehicles on roadways. Is there a movement underway to treat cycling differently and preferentially? From Brendan Hogan, what would it take for VDOT to start charging vehicle registration fees based on vehicle weight? Jeff Forward, I'm on my local select board and I'm interested in learning how we can implement policies on the local level that encourage folks to walk and bike and can reduce hazards between bike ped and motor vehicles. Sarah says, I'm based only on the basics of the laws. Well, welcome, you're in the right place. Dave Spidell has some basic rider questions. Hi, Dave. When can you take the lane? Also, are you able to report cones on the bike lane? I know it's for safety, but they often come out of nowhere with all the construction right now, and it's dangerous to navigate. Greg, what laws do we currently have to force engineers, traffic engineers and planners to provide safe infrastructure for bicyclists, pedestrians when building or repaving roads? Bethany, as a pedestrian on rural roads with no sidewalks, limited shoulders, cars should not regularly slide over to give me room, and I'm often pushed into the ditch. Sarah is continuing her comment to say she's here to learn and hope that infrastructure changes can happen. And Jeff says there's tension between bikes and motors in our town. Some complain when cyclists claim the lane, and others advocate for cyclists to claim the lane so that motors don't pass in unsafe ways. Bruce, potential laws, remove far to right in favor of universal slow moving vehicle laws. I am seeing a lot of names on here that I recognize. Hello, folks. All right. I think we've got a good bunch of a good collection of questions here. A lot of these we are already going to cover in our presentation, but we're going to make sure we circle back to some of these as we go forward. All right, so let's talk about why walk and bike laws matter. Now, John did say that on the hierarchy of things that people keep us safe on our roadways, behavior changes, which is laws, is fairly low down. But what they do is they actually create a culture of how our roads are used and who has priority on our roadways. And that piece can influence our thinking and trickles down to the people building our infrastructure. So good walk bike laws can make us safer and encourage walking and biking. Bad ones are frequently broken because they make it harder for people walking and biking and can make it more dangerous. In addition, bad walk bike laws that focus on prioritizing the movement of motor vehicle traffic can create a culture that the only legitimate road user is the motor vehicle driver and that everyone else has secondary priority or tertiary priority to the roadways. So when we change our walk bike laws or and make them more egalitarian for all of us who use our public spaces, we are creating a culture which will then allow us to prioritize creating safer spaces for folks. So in my work, I hear a lot that bicyclists are scofflaws, that this particular road user is especially egregious with breaking the laws, and that therefore they don't deserve investment in infrastructure because they're just bad actors on our roadways. But is that true? This is from the JHSP Attitude Survey Report from 2018. This is self-reported behavior. This isn't even observed behavior. This is behavior people are telling the survey taker. And people have a tendency to err on the side of making themselves look good. And this was a question on the speed limit of 30 miles an hour. How often do you drive faster than 35 miles an hour? And you can see this question has been asked since 2010. And the average, the percentage of folks in who said that they go more than 35 miles an hour in a 30-mile an hour zone is 34%. That is over a third of folks. And only 13.6% of folks said never. So the people who do 35 plus, that 34%, said they did it most of the time or half of the time. And I want to just state here that a 30-mile-an-hour road is a road that's usually where people live and work. It's a residential area or a commercial area where there's people getting out to do business. So there's a lot of families or people walking and biking and doing their business as vulnerable users. So speeding in this area is particularly dangerous because it puts vulnerable users at risk. Driver behavior for roads that are 60 miles an hour, 65 miles an hour, people will go 70 plus. And this number is slightly less. 23.4% of folks report doing speeding most of the time or half of the time. This is significant too because 65-mile-an-hour roads are not residential areas and they are not commercial spaces where people are walking and biking, and people are less likely to admit to speeding in those areas. So not only do we have a decent percentage of people who admit to speeding in these areas, they're also more likely to speed where it is less safe for their neighbors. Again, self-reported behavior on drinking and driving. Now, this number looks pretty small. Whether they've operated a vehicle within 2 hours of having 2 or more alcoholic beverages within the last year. And that's 10.2%, which seems like a small number, but then you think 1 out of 10 of every person you are sharing the roadway with has driven drunk this year. That is not okay. So do they break the law more often? Do bicyclists break the law more often? Locomotion did a observational survey over the course of 3 years with volunteers. And we measured a lot of vulnerable user behaviors as well as motor vehicle behaviors in the course of this study. Out of 331 observed intersection actions, like whether people came to a complete stop, how, or if they rolled through the stop sign, that kind of thing. 67% of people on bikes came to a stop at a stop sign or stoplight. And the average compliance is almost at 70%. So the numbers are, around 30% of non-compliance. Basically, you can count on 1/3 of road users, no matter how they're using the roadways, to break the rules. But let's talk about the reasons why. This is from a study on scofflaw bicycling, illegal but rational, where they surveyed road users on what the decisions they would make in certain intersections and whether they would make an illegal choice. They found out that unlawful drivers and pedestrians will rationalize their law breaking for the reasons of time saving. They're worried about being late. Bicyclists will also rationalize their law breaking. I mean, we rationalize our reasons for making choices that are less ideal. So, but the bicyclist reasons they were more inclined to cite their own personal safety or saving energy. So, if you didn't come to a complete stop at a stop sign because there was a hill right next to it, for example, saving energy. NHTSA also took a look at the reasons why people sped, and drivers, most of the reason why drivers speed is because of getting stuck in traffic and worrying about running late. So not only do bicyclists break laws at the same rate, but the reasoning for breaking their laws are more for protecting themselves than for things like, not being late for work. Over the course of history, we have really seen a big shift in how our roads are used and who are perceived as owning the roads. In the 1800s and 1900s, you can see lots and lots of photos of people just being wherever they want to be in the road. You can see most of these photos, people are just walking, chilling out. You'll see some photos where people are having straight up conversations in the middle of the road. We wouldn't see that in a, major thoroughfare nowadays. That would be far too dangerous. Our roads were perceived as fully public spaces. Everyone had access to them. They could use them as they saw fit. You obviously had to exercise a certain amount of common sense and caution, but nobody was given priority over anyone else in any meaningful codified way. And what ended up happening was motor vehicles became more popular. And as they became more popular, they became more of a danger because they're large, heavy vehicles that can get a fair bit of momentum even back then. And so people started to push back on drivers having all this access to our roadway. This is an op-ed. Pedestrians should insist upon their prior right to the crossings, and drivers should learn that they must never trot over crossings unless there are no pedestrians approaching. The idea here is that the pedestrian has priority and not the motor vehicle. I don't think we would recognize that sentiment today. We've had people trying to put speed governors on vehicles in cities, say that you cannot go any faster than 25 miles an hour within a city. Which shall it be? A limit of 25 miles per hour and safety, or no limit and the lurking danger of death? I really like how dramatic they are about all this. And even Secretary Hoover got involved, right? An alarming increase in automobile fatalities, studying huge problem. So there was this big outcry against motor vehicles in our cities and on our streets. There would be mothers blockading streets after a child was struck and killed. You can find articles of those all over the place. They just blocked the street and protested the vehicles being in the roadways, and there was a large public sentiment against motor vehicles. But automobile companies did not like this, of course. This definitely threatened their business, so they hired advertisers to help come up with a counter narrative to the whole concept of whose responsibility it is if someone gets struck and killed. So they came up with a campaign around jaywalking. And now jaywalking is used as a casual phrase to talk about illegally crossing the road at a place other than the designated crossing area. But it was specifically designed. We don't have this word really in our language now, but back then a jay was a pretty nasty pejorative. It's something along the line of an ungovernable hick. And it was really embarrassing to be called a jay. And so they used that and leveraged it to embarrass people. And you can see this quote down at the bottom. It says, the pedestrian may say that if he chooses to risk life or limb, it is his own affair, but it is not his own affair if he forces another citizen to be his partner in a serious accident. The jaywalker rarely indulges his willfulness at his own expense. So they're basically saying this guy made this motor vehicle driver hit him And boy, don't you just feel bad for the driver for hitting this jaywalker. And we have that sentiment nowadays. Here's another automobile funded ad trying to talk about just how foolish those jaywalkers are. Look at these silly gooses just out in the road. You know, they're worse than somebody looking down the barrel of a gun, wondering if it's loaded. This is pretty heavy-handed, but this campaign was out everywhere. You can find so many examples, and I believe the jaywalking cartoon is from the 1920s. So there was just a lot of conflict around this, and you can see how people were starting to wonder who got to have the road and how could somebody who was able to be using the road was whose responsibility is it, and how can we think about that responsibility. So this cartoon came out and they were saying, look at the world we're creating here. This world where this pedestrian needs to have a horn on his head and a mirror on his shoulder and a giant light in his hand and a giant light behind him, 2 giant lights in his hand. Like, look how ridiculous this is. People shouldn't have to live like this. And so that this is like this idea, this ridiculous example of how extreme we have to be safe. But let's take a look at modern safety messaging. And there it is, the same thing, but not ironically. Be bright, wear reflective clothing, never jaywalk, don't be a distracted walker, stay alert, watch for turning vehicles. Now, it is your responsibility to keep yourself safe, but the language around responsibility for safety has switched from being the responsibility of the person driving the heavy machine to the person who doesn't have any protections whatsoever. So I'm going to hand it back to John now that we've talked about all of these historical contexts and how we have built up this space where pedestrians are now trespassers on the public property that they fund with their taxes. I'm going to move to John now.
All right. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, that whole sort of historical perspective about how we sort of got to where we are now. So just a couple of slides here about crash data, because I think that's important too, just to understand like where are crashes involving vulnerable users happening. So not surprisingly, a pretty good number are happening at intersections, and that kind of makes sense because those are places where you have inherently there are conflict points between vehicles and people walking and biking, and so especially you can see for bicyclists about 75% of crashes occur at intersections, and up to half of the pedestrian crashes. So there are I think the bigger like fear, I think that if you can go back one. Yeah. I'll just wait for to get caught up on the slides there, but I was just going to say, I think the big, fear that people have is kind of being struck from behind, and those crashes do occur. And I guess I was looking at this trying to decipher the different categories here before, but so basically for bicyclist fatalities in the US over a 3-year period, about 28% of those were from a car, coming up behind a bicyclist. So next. This I'm sure you've seen a graphic like this. I've seen a bunch of different versions of it. It's just emphasizing how important speed is in terms of the safety of people walking and biking. So if a car is going, 20 miles an hour, then there's only a 5% chance that a bicyclist or pedestrian would be killed. And just going up to 30 miles an hour, you can see how that changes to, increases to 45% and then 85% if the car is going 40. So it's really important to, especially in like downtown and village areas where, biking and walking is much more expected, to do things with design to keep driver speeds low. I saw one comment in the chat regarding speed limits, and that could be a whole, we could probably spend an hour talking about speed limits and the process behind setting speed limits, but just changing the speed limit sign without doing any other design changes is usually not very effective at changing driver behavior. So it really, again, comes back to, doing things with design, like narrower travel lanes, having kind of that roadside visual corridor with like trees, curbing, on-street parking, things like that, that really reinforce drivers going at a slower speed is what makes a big impact. Next. Let's see, and is this one back to you? No. So yeah, just real quickly. So this is a case of kind of a law that we feel makes sense. If you're a bicyclist going against traffic, you are at almost 4 times greater risk of a crash than riding with traffic. Basically what happens, and I know that Mary Catherine teaches this in locomotions education with kids, because a lot of kids will ride on the sidewalk. But even if you're on the sidewalk, if you are going against traffic, you are at a much higher risk. People kind of think, oh, we're on the sidewalk, we're perfectly safe. But basically, when you're going against traffic, whether you're on the road or on a sidewalk, you're in a position that drivers are not normally looking for a conflict. And especially a bicyclist that can travel at 10 to 15 miles an hour, you just sort of come into a driver's field of vision so quickly that they often don't see you. So Vermont law does require bicyclists to ride with traffic. And just in case, since I mentioned sidewalks, and this is a question I would say I get pretty frequently. So state law is kind of silent about bicyclists riding on sidewalks. However, local, municipalities can regulate their sidewalks, and some municipalities in Vermont have laws about or prohibiting bicyclists from riding on sidewalks, or cyclists of a certain age from riding on sidewalks. So that kind of goes town by town, but there's no state law that addresses that. I think that's back to you, Mary Catherine.
Just to interrupt, and we also have at least one city that requires people to ride on sidewalks on their bike on at least some of their roads, which is actually provably less safe than being based on the way sidewalks are designed.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems is often sidewalks are, they're not wide enough to function for multiple users. And so that creates some kind of inherent conflicts right there.
Exactly. All right, so we're gonna take a moment to brainstorm again. So based on the kind of information we just learned about how intersections are really unsafe, how people do get struck even from behind while riding, how speed is a factor in safety, and how salmoning, riding against traffic, is much more dangerous. Let's talk about now, get your ideas of laws that you are aware of in Vermont that prioritize the free movement of motor vehicles. I am being told that my audio is choppy, so I'm going to try and solve that and let John take over.
Yeah, so I guess we just want you to think, and I think we've already seen a couple in the chat, but and we have our own answers to this. What laws that are on the books do you think prioritize kind of cars over pedestrians and bicyclists? So you can just think about that for a second or two, and if you have a thought, you can just put that in the chat. And then we have our own answers to that question, or a few that we wanted to point out. I did see, I'm trying to think, I'm going back to the chat. So I saw, let's see, someone said something about the as far to the right. So just real quickly, and I think after this, or maybe Locomotion already has it on their site, summary of the existing laws. But so in Vermont, the law is for bicyclists that you ride as far to the right as is, I'm not going to get the language right. It's either practicable or safe. I can't remember which. And then there are a series of exceptions. So if there's debris, or if you're getting ready to make a left turn, or if there are other reasons that you can't ride safely as far to the right, you can come out into the lane. Yeah, I'm seeing some good ones now. Right turn on red, absolutely. That can really cause some conflicts with pedestrians, especially.
Listen, that one's
Yeah.
not on the list, so good job, Greg.
Yeah. I also see, so we'll just do a quick clarification because someone brought up the 3 feet. So Vermont law currently says that a motor vehicle has to pass a vulnerable user, which there's a definition, and that definition includes bicyclists and pedestrians, as well as some other users like people on horseback and farm equipment and so forth. It says that motorists have to pass vulnerable users with due care, including increased clearance and a recommended 4 feet. So it is not a strict, you shall give 4 feet. It's recommended. I was actually down at the legislature when that was all getting discussed, and law enforcement was very leery to adopt the strict distance because of enforceability. And the due care language is common in a lot of motor vehicle law in the state. So that's what they ended up going with. Now, there's been debate about that back and forth. So, but that's what the current law is. Yep. I'm seeing so many good questions in here.
Yes, and I saw Jeff's thing about cyclists should be able to and encouraged to claim the lane going over narrow bridges, find uphill curbs on town roads, and I agree.
Great. And I see Jonathan just put a good resource in the chat.
Yep. Yeah, I have to leave that link, but it's much for seeing some of the laws that apply to you.
Yeah. So I think we're turning this back to you, Mary Catherine, because it sounds like your sound is good.
I hope so. Let me know if it becomes a problem again. All right, so Thank you all for the list. You actually added some to ours, for sure. But we also came up with a handful ourselves. So laws that are directed at pedestrians that favor motorists in Vermont, as pedestrians are required to cross a crosswalk where there are traffic control signals. They have to yield right of way to motorists if they're not crossing at a crosswalk. They may not cross an intersection diagonally and are required to use sidewalks where present. They must walk on the left-hand side of the road if there is no sidewalk. And this one is kind of big. So there's a limited local control over speed limits. If local roads can't be reduced to below 35 miles an hour unless there's an engineering approval, in which it can then be under 25 miles an hour. So there's a minimum set, which is very interesting. Motor vehicles only have to yield to vulnerable users in crosswalks. In Vermont, it's a yield, it's not a stop, by the way. And it's a confusing but real difference. This is an equity issue. It doesn't necessarily prioritize motorists, but it's important to talk about. There's also local control given to whether electric assistive equipment can be used on a sidewalk. And by electric assistive equipment, I mean, motorized wheelchairs and those kinds of things for people with mobility impairment. More laws that favor motorists. These are for bicyclists. Things like ride as far to the right as possible, or as is practicable. No riding more than 2 abreast because it impedes traffic. And then again, local control over bike laws for roadways. So in this case, for example, in my town, they actually say you can only ride single file in my town on our roadways. All right, John.
All right, so just a couple of visuals here to sort of discuss how sometimes there's a kind of inherent conflict between what the law says and what your common sense tells you. So this is a pretty typical, rural, narrow road in Vermont. And so if you think about that law that says that if there's no sidewalk, pedestrians must use the, left-hand side of the roadway or walk against traffic. I know if it were me and I were walking on this road, like, into the picture, coming up to that curve, I would not be very comfortable on the left-hand side of the road because I have no visual for cars that are coming around there, and similar for the car driver. They don't have a line of sight to me. So I would be much more inclined to go over to the right-hand side of the road and go around the outside of the curve. So that's just one example of, I guess, technically you would be breaking the law to do that behavior, but it probably is a safer thing to do. Next. So kind of similarly, kind of if the law also says that if there's a sidewalk on one side of the road, that pedestrians should use it or must use it. But unfortunately, we have things like utility poles, or in the winter, sidewalks that are not cleared of snow, or sidewalks that exist but have fallen into disrepair and don't meet standards for accessibility. So if you happen to be using a wheelchair or some other mobility device, you've got some problems. Same with riding, is it always the safest choice to ride as far to the right as possible? Not necessarily. Sometimes it is safer to, take the lane and make yourself as visible as possible. So there are some issues with that one as well. And yeah, so now kind of turning that last question on its head a little bit, what are some laws that you can think of that you feel have the safety of bicyclists or pedestrians, in mind? And we can just take a few seconds and people can put those in the chat. All right, I'm seeing a few good recommendation or suggestions. Yeah, I'll just clarify. So someone noticed or made a comment about the where practicable. That language is actually only in the law around riding a bike as far to the right as practicable. I don't believe that's in the law regarding pedestrians walking on the left-hand side if there's no sidewalk. So yeah, let's go to our suggestion, Mary Catherine. I think that's back to you.
Thank you. So here's some laws that we thought actually sort of were prioritizing the safety and accessibility of our roadways for people who walk and bike and roll on our roadways. So bicyclists can take the lane in certain situations. So that is a relatively new law, happened like in 2018, I believe. And it provided exceptions to the keep right law, which used to just be you had to keep as far to the right as practicable. And then in the newer version, it added the caveats that folks have seen mentioned in the chat. And also recently enacted is the recommended passing distance of 4 feet. So previously it just said, pass vulnerable users with due care, and due care is pretty fuzzy for folks. So giving an actual recommended distance really does help people understand what they should be providing to folks when they pass them. There's a law about close following and harassing vulnerable users being illegal. No throwing objects at vulnerable users, that is a law. And you would be shocked to learn how frequently that law is broken, even here in Vermont. More laws are motor vehicles and often bicycles are not allowed on sidewalks, and they can't pass motor vehicles that are stopped for pedestrians at crosswalks. And of note, a crosswalk doesn't have to have the crosswalk lines. Anytime there is an intersection, there is an invisible crosswalk there that has the same legal protections as a painted crosswalk. This is a law that could go either way. Municipalities may limit bike riding on sidewalks. All right, so we are now at the point where we are talking about our ideas for future laws that we would like to see on our roadways and some discussion, as well as your ideas. So we are going to start with, sorry, John, I took your spot, so you can take over.
Yeah, that's totally fine. And I hopefully people saw in the chat, thank you, Jonathan Weber, for clarifying. So there is a where practicable exception in the walking law, or so just to make that clarification. Yeah, so I think this is where we're going to get into kind of more of an open discussion, and just see, I think we've already gotten a few comments in the chat about ideas people have for new laws or ways to strengthen existing laws. I will say, again, just going to my experience being down at the State House when laws are discussed, is that sometimes the legislature, you may go down there with very good intentions of making things safer by making some change or proposing something new. And that they can sometimes head off in a completely unexpected direction with whatever you're trying to achieve. So just kind of the caution about the unintended consequences. One year I was down there, they were discussing a bicycle helmet law that was being proposed. And suddenly we were talking about making it mandatory that bicyclists ride single file at all times. So that's just an example of how things can kind of go off the rails in the legislature. So I guess we'll give people a couple of seconds to put some ideas in. I'm just seeing we've got okay, so I do want to talk about this one. So Charlie suggested vehicles following a bicycle must yield to an oncoming traffic before passing a bicycle. That is already the law. The law very clearly says that you can't pass. Basically, it says you can't pass unless it's safe to do so. Now, I'm a bicyclist. I see that law ignored all the time. It's actually probably one of my bigger pet peeves as a bicyclist. I'm very appreciative of the extra space that I'm being given, but not when it puts the driver and whoever might be coming around the blind corner at risk, as well as me possibly.
Yeah, I just want to take a
Sure.
moment here and share what I tell folks to do when passing a vulnerable user, to either slow or stop until it is safe to pass safely. So some people try to do the maneuver called threading the needle, which I've seen described a couple of times. It's terrifying for everyone. So instead of trying to do that, wait until there's a safe moment to both preserve everyone's safety. So one of the cultural and design aspects of roadways is the expectation that you keep moving at all times at all costs unless you absolutely cannot move. And that is what contributes to threading the needle behavior. And when you then give somebody a new way of thinking, which is slowing or stopping until it's safe to pass, that helps people understand how to be less frightening when engaging with vulnerable users in cases.
All right, I'm seeing some suggestion about speed limits for cyclists on dedicated paths. And then there's a little bit of a comment there about e-bikes, but also acknowledging that a regular bike can go 30 miles an hour, especially on a downhill of any type. So, yeah, so I think, that is something that a municipality could do already. They basically have jurisdiction over roads and other transportation facilities that are not maintained and owned by VTrans, by the state. So they certainly have the ability to do that. Probably, I'm not aware of too many paths that have speed limits on them. Not many bicycles have a speedometer on them. Some do, of course, but anyway, that one might be, I think that one could be tough from a enforcement and just sort of equipment standpoint.
Yeah, and to add to that, just to clarify about e-bike speeds, class 3 e-bikes, the max speed they're allowed to go is 28 miles an hour with their assist, just as a point of data.
Yeah. So I don't know what our next slide is here, Mary Catherine. I think we were.
That is yours slide. You have the advanced pedestrian signal discussion.
Yeah, so this is let's see, bicycles per V. Okay, so some of our pedestrian signals have what's called a leading pedestrian interval, and that's where the walk phase comes on a few seconds before the parallel traffic green light comes on, and that's to actually help with like turning traffic and pedestrians in the crosswalk, so pedestrians have a chance to get out into the crosswalk. And so the idea with this would be that bicyclists could also start going through the intersection with that leading pedestrian interval. There also is the ability to add in bicycle specific signals, although that would, not to get too far in the weeds, but Vermont follows what's called the MUTCD. That's the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. That's in our state law, that we follow that, as well as municipalities. And that is the guide for signs, signals, pavement markings, all traffic control devices. And so to use bicycle specific signals, I believe still requires a sort of interim approval. So if the state wanted to do it, or if a town wanted to do it, they would have to submit a request and get it approved. I believe that is when the MUTCD gets updated, which it's on track to be done fairly soon, that bicycle specific signals will be part of the next MUTCD. So you won't have to go through that experimental process. So I guess any thoughts about, I'll just say like, one thing I think about that idea of bikes with the advanced pedestrian signal, I think unless there was very widespread understanding about that some motorists would perceive that as, there's already a perception that, quote unquote, all bicyclists run red lights. I've heard that statement before, just like all motorists obey all the traffic laws all the time. And, I think that might add to that perception, unfortunately, without a lot of, education and outreach about it.
And I was speaking with Jonathan about this. I think if folks want to raise their hand and be unmuted to talk about their thoughts about the advanced pedestrian signal, that it makes sense to do that. We can start hearing.
I would also like, Mary Catherine, maybe we want to have you go through the Idaho stop too, because that's another one that, and then people could discuss either one of those.
Okay, yeah, let's combine those two. Absolutely. Sounds good to me. All right, so let's talk about the Idaho stop. So some of you may have heard about this. So what is it? For those of you who've never heard of it before. Basically, there's a recognition that bikes are not the same type of vehicle as a motor vehicle. And that people who ride bikes would treat a stop sign like a yield sign. And that stop lights will be treated like stop signs. And those are slightly subtle differences that have some good safety and road experience benefits. This law has seemed somewhat radical, but it is actually gaining some real momentum in the U.S. A few years ago, there were only two states really with a version of the Idaho stop. That was Idaho and then Delaware. So Delaware has the Delaware yield, so it doesn't have the stop aspect of it. So the stoplight is still a stop no matter what. But so it's a slightly watered down version. You can see that it is picking up momentum across the board. And here's why people are kind of excited about it. It's got some real safety benefits. First of all, it gets people out in front of traffic before the big heavy vehicles start moving as well. So remember that slide with that mom and the kid in the back, and there are just all these cars everywhere. This would help people get up ahead of those cars and moving down the road before all those conflicts at the intersection start happening. So you then get the reduced exposure to crashes at intersections. It does conserve forward momentum. So when you're riding a bike, you have much more feedback for the way the road topography is than you do when you're driving a car. So, you are disinclined to come to an unnecessary stop and lose that momentum and lose that energy. Even just slowing down a bit is big. It still allows you to preserve some momentum to then keep moving again. Coming to a complete stop and then starting takes a lot more energy. And it also decriminalizes rational behavior. If there isn't somebody at the stop sign, why stop? I mean, the worst laws are the laws that are unnecessary for safety and also are really inconvenient to follow. Those laws are almost certainly going to get broken. So decriminalizing rational behavior is generally a good move. It makes law enforcement's job easier and it makes less lawbreaking. And you can see over here in this chart that the safety benefits of having an Idaho stop was large. So crashes involving bicycles dropped by 23% at stop signs 30 months after the introduction of the Delaware yield law. That's big, right? So they did a 30-month study before the law and then a 30-month study after the law. And you can see a nice drop there, which is great news, right? And then it even made there be less crashes in other parts of the roadway as well, incidentally. And the study didn't explain why that happened, but you can see, and this was also shown in Idaho too. They have a lower crash rate in Idaho as well. So let's talk a little bit about both the advanced pedestrian signal and the Idaho stop law. And let's hear your ideas and inputs. If you want to speak, using your voice, raise your hand and Jonathan will unmute you.
Okay, Dave King, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't have a question. I just hit the wrong button there. Sorry. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's all right. Thanks. Yeah, if anyone else would like to make a comment, you can just raise your hand, or you're welcome to still use the chat if you prefer to type it out.
So I'm seeing a question about whether there's interest about the Idaho stop in Vermont. I have not seen it discussed down in the legislature or seen any proposals about it in the last, yeah, I've never seen it that proposed. And so, yeah, it's hard to know like how much support there would be for that. I did see someone ask a question, which is a good question that I don't have an answer to, whether a municipality could adopt the Idaho stop within that municipality. I didn't, that is really a more of a legal question that a town would have to get that answered by their, legal counsel.
Yeah, that could be a nice step though towards a statewide law to try it out in Burlington or somewhere that tends to have more progressive walk bike laws.
And I'm seeing some really interesting and thoughtful points about needing to have a large public information campaign before enacting the law, which makes a lot of sense because currently drivers have some pretty big feelings about bicyclists who run a stop sign. So they need to be very clear about this new law and what it means and how it works. And Dave did say that maybe this isn't a great law for kids because kids are not as developed with their decision making and risk assessment skills, and that also makes sense. Although I do believe the laws are universal to all ages, and I haven't seen anything specific about kids being endangered in my research, but I'm not going to say that my research delved into every aspect of the demographics. Right. Yeah. It looks like folks are. Yes. How can we raise awareness about this idea to push it forward? One thing we would like to do is, as a result of these conversations we're having about our bike laws, is to collect the names of folks interested in engaging in this conversation and bringing it forward. The only way change will be made is if we all speak up and indicate that we're interested in this. So we will be asking folks at the end if they want to engage with us in these initiatives to improve our roadway safety. And it's obviously a voluntary opt-in situation. Thank you. Yes, and then driver's ed. Yeah, driver's ed teachers are actually very interested in vulnerable user safety and roadway safety issues. In my experience, we do programming around teaching young drivers how to interact safely with vulnerable users, and driver's ed teachers have been generally very responsive. They also have an annual conference that they run. So this is the kind of thing where we can engage their support and interest through those methods. Thank you. These are really excellent questions. Okay, let's move forward to the change lane to path discussion, which is me. So this one is one that is really interesting and kind of new. So we are just sort of feeling the waters and very much want to discuss this with everybody and get your thoughtful ideas. So the change lane to pass idea was proposed in Virginia, and it's a solution to the really good question of how does a law enforcement officer even force a passing distance of 3 or 4 or 5 feet. It's very hard to eyeball that, right? And it's hard to judge it without a reference point. Difficult to prove it in court unless it's like the pass was egregious, like really close passing. I know I've seen bicycle advocates here in Vermont come to police officers with video, and even that wasn't considered compelling enough to bring to court, just because of how video lenses work and how things can look closer than they really are. So the neat thing about changing lanes to pass, right, is that it is measurable. You can see, okay, are the wheels on the other side of the yellow line? And you can actually see that and enforce that. So it was a really interesting approach to this. It also, because it forces everyone to commit to go into the other line, it may also reduce the incidence of threading the needle behaviors that we often see on our roadways, that a lot of you actually commented on, where people try to, sneak in between an oncoming vehicle and a vulnerable user, and really creating an unsafe situation for everyone. So Virginia did enact it, and so far it seems to have gone well, but there's not a lot of data that I was fully to on it. But I would love to hear your ideas, your thoughts on the change lane to pass, pros, cons, that kind of thing. We do have some hands up, Jonathan. Greg and Jason.
Yes, we do. All right, let's go to Greg first.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, so I like this idea of requiring the change lanes to pass on. I'm especially thinking of rural roads that are narrow, where there's no shoulder, which is an awful lot of the rural roads in Vermont. Where I see this leading to a lot of ambiguity is where you have a fog line. And if you have 6 feet on the other side of the fog line, you'd call that a shoulder. And as a cyclist, I would feel that pretty safe to ride in, and I wouldn't expect a driver to use the other lane to pass me if I have a shoulder that wide to ride in. But what often happens is the shoulder is only 1 or 2 feet wide. And in that case, I might be riding right on that fog line, or I might be riding to the left of the fog line because there's no safe shoulder to ride on. Or I might be in the shoulder part of the time, and then the shoulder disappears, 200 feet down the road. And so I'm kind of going back and forth. And I see, and so that's where I see some potential problems with wording a law like this. So it's just something to think about if we were to pursue this.
I agree. I think the specifics on when and where to apply this law would be really extremely important. Thank you, Greg. That was very thoughtful. I think Jason is next.
So you can hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Yeah. So I like this idea as a law, because this is basically the way I ride in Burlington, is that I take the lane and I'll ride like as far out to the yellow line as I can, so that if someone wants to pass me, they can go fully into the other lane. And then I have a big cushion to my right if something goes wrong or something like that. But when you stay as far to the right as possible and someone goes to pass you and something goes wrong, you might get a flat or whatever else, then you have no margin of error. And so I really like this. I think it's nice to do. Someone made a comment about like, what do you do when there's a blind corner? They don't like to cross over the double yellow line on the blind corner. It's called slow down or stop and wait till there's a place where you can actually see to pass. And so I think that's a really big thing about the threading the needle. That's I think I deal with people even still try to thread the needle when you're all the way out the yellow line. They try to like get in between you and an oncoming car sometimes. So I think it's good because it's very enforceable, right? It's not the, what did you do? You can see whether they went over a center line and gave enough distance. And so, yeah, I'd love to see something like this go forward. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That you are allowed to pass. Thank you, Dave. You are actually allowed to pass on a double yellow. You just have to follow a lot of careful rules when you do it to make sure you're doing it safely, for sure. So I'm seeing something here because I know someone asked about that as well. So thank you. This is great. All right. Any other thoughts or comments?
Not seeing any hands, so unless you or John see something in the chat that you want to address, I think we can move on.
I have a question, I guess. Have we, or I know we haven't, but has Locomotion done any specific, like, PSAs or whatever about the danger of threading the needle? I've heard that come up like, numerous times today. So seems like an education opportunity that we need to maybe look into if we haven't done that.
Yeah, that's a campaign I very much want to do. We've done some informal campaigns about how to handle the passing law safely, and we've done on radio spots and stuff. It just explained to people how to handle passing folks safely. And one thing I like to sort of illustrate the reason why it's important to have a good 4-foot buffer or more is basically what you want to do is if somebody goes, falls over just straight up sideways on their bike, you will not run over a part of their body with your vehicle, right? So, if you get away from them enough that no matter what happens, you will not strike them. That is a good kind of way to think of how to pass a vulnerable user safely. If you do it really slowly and you give them distance, again, that gives enough space and buffer for if something goes horribly wrong.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'll just, I would love to see a campaign that has a very simple message, which I saw several people in the chat say, which is like, just wait. That's all the campaign could say is, wait, like, what does it take? Like 5 seconds to wait and make sure that it's clear, or, it's like, and this is kind of a larger traffic safety problem that is affecting not just vulnerable users, but everybody on the road. And I've heard this is true at the national level, the amount of what I would call aggressive driving is way up. And if you look at the overall like traffic fatalities in Vermont for this year, it's the highest it's been in 4 years as of this date, or 5 years. So we're on a really bad trend in terms of traffic safety.
We are. And it has a lot to do with the way our roads are designed. They're designed to just keep moving forward constantly. And what that does is it creates a sense that something is wrong if you have to slow down or stop.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would just reinforce, like, going all the way back to the very first slide, we're talking specifically about laws here. In terms of effectiveness for safety, we're kind of way down the pyramid on what's going to work. It really does come back to that design. And I know that, like, on the national level, I've seen, forget which organization, maybe Transportation for America, came out with a great sort of campaign basically pointing out, like, when it comes to vulnerable, well, actually all users, and Federal Highway acknowledges this too, speed and safety are like inherently linked, and you can't have both. You can't have increased speed that's going to decrease safety, especially for vulnerable users. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And Timothy said that he tells folks that you should pass a bike like they pass a farm tractor, and that is excellent advice for those folks who are actually respectful around tractors. My husband is a farmer and has had the same kind of interactions as a tractor operator as he has when he was riding a bike. So unfortunately, people are impatient with every kind of slow moving vehicle. Unfortunately, I wish it were different. But at the very least, it gives them some idea of how much space to give, which is really helpful. Thank you. All right, we have actually one more. Oh, wait, hang on. Somebody is talking, and I think this may be a Jonathan or John question from Jack Forward that I think is possibly interesting.
Yeah, I can try to take that one because I'm involved with the plan that Jeff is mentioning. So this was the Richmond Walk Bike Master Plan. It's still in draft form, and one of the recommendations is to remove center lines on some roadways. There's a lot of evidence that drivers go slower when there isn't a center line. It's sort of like if you imagine if you were coloring in a coloring book and coloring between the lines, you can color a lot faster than you would if you were trying to sketch something, the same thing freehand. So there is a lot of evidence that roads without center lines do have slower operation. I think part of Jeff's concern, if I recall from the meeting, was about visibility in foggy weather or at night, and I think that's definitely something to think about. Fog lines could be striped instead of having a center line, which would help still guide people to know where they need to be on the roadway. And that's probably not a recommendation that's appropriate for every road, but a lot of places I think it is suitable.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, we have one more idea to talk about, and this one is John's.
Yeah, this is just another sort of legal thing that it exists in some Canadian jurisdictions and a lot of the EU countries. It's just this idea of presumptive fault. So in a case where there's a crash involving a car and a bicyclist, the driver is presumed to be at fault. Again, Mary Catherine and I are not legal scholars, but I did do a little checking about this with our legal folks. And basically Vermont law relies on who is found to have operated negligently. So there's no presumption of fault. And, I think this would be kind of a tall order to get this through the legislature. But we thought it was worth at least mentioning as something that does exist out there. I'm not sure within the US if there are jurisdictions that have this or not, but we thought we'd throw this out there as part of the discussion.
So we can talk about presumptive fault. It's the idea of basically with great power comes great responsibility in terms of motor vehicles, and the fact that you're operating a 1-2+ ton vehicle, and how that added danger that you bring to the roadway is also involves added responsibility and culpability when you are operating that vehicle. It would be hard to get folks to agree to it in our motor-centric culture for sure, but it is an interesting idea and one worth at least bringing into the conversation, so we're thinking about it and it's in our heads.
Yeah, and if folks have a comment, you're welcome to raise your hand. We did have, Dave commented that drivers in the EU tend to be more respectful of bikers. And I have heard people mention this sort of presumptive fault legal difference as being one of the things that could be influencing that.
And I see a question from Catherine about who pays the medical costs when a pedestrian is struck by someone driving a car in a crosswalk and the person driving was clearly at fault. Wow, in New Jersey, the pedestrian's car insurance pays for all medical expenses for the pedestrian. John, I think the information you got from legal may answer that.
Yeah, yeah, I'm not sure on that, the payment side of things. But that seems very, I mean, what Catherine just said, that just seems completely crazy. But it wouldn't be the first law that I've thought that about. You know, we haven't talked about this, and it's not really a legal thing, but it did make me think of, you know, there has been some research on when there is a news story about a crash involving a bicyclist or a pedestrian, very often the language that is used in those news stories does not present the vulnerable user as a person. It's often, they get referred to in that sort of generic term, you know, as well as, so that the article might say, you know, a pedestrian was struck by a car, as if the car were just out there operating on its own, you know. And I know that there are some that think that that is our future, that the cars will be operating on our own. I have some major doubts that that will ever happen. And I'm not too excited about the fact that we're even talking about it, but that's my own personal opinion. But anyway, that just made me think of, there is kind of a bias. I mean, and this goes to our culture, you know, the car is very dominant in the US, and we're slowly working against that. And but anyway.
Yeah, one of another presentation I'm working on is actually how we discuss crashes in our media. And one is to give agency to motor vehicles. So it'll say car crashes into building, as though we just have a whole bunch of rogue vehicles. It's sort of like driving around, just crashing into things. On top of it, they refer to crashes as accidents, which makes it sound like a lightning strike, as opposed to part of a systemic set of issues that are actually entirely preventable, not entirely, but almost entirely preventable if we just restructured our infrastructure and our culture to reduce the inevitability of human error. So humans make mistakes. That's literally, you know, what human error is about. That is one of the few constants in life. So when we design a system, we need to design with the idea that people will make mistakes as part of it. And so when there is a crash, it is not just like an inevitable fluke, but actually just part of a systemic design that we have failed to account for. Yeah. Anyone else?
Not seeing any hands at the moment. This one might be a bit too legalistic.
Yeah. All right. So we are basically at the end of our presentation. Does anyone have any other questions, comments, ideas? Raise your hand to talk. We'd like to hear your voices, or you can write in the chat. And John is adding some links at the bottom about Bike Bridge in the Netherlands as an example of infrastructure that helps reduce the consequences of inevitable human mistakes by separating people on bikes from people in cars.
I'll just, while people are thinking of any other last comments. One thing I would encourage people to do is to pay attention to the calendar when the legislature's in session. Looking at both the House Transportation Committee and the Senate Transportation Committee. And if you see, they post the agenda every week, and if you see items related to biking and walking and traffic safety, I don't know if they're going to continue it this year. Last year, because of COVID, most testimony was done remotely, and you could, and then there was like a YouTube recording if you couldn't attend the committee, during the actual time. There was some discussion last year that I think most active transportation advocates would have been not very happy with. And so I think we all need to, as Vermont residents, who are interested in biking and walking, pay very close attention to what is going on in the legislature and be ready to, mobilize if we need to fight against some proposals that might come out of those two committees.
Mhm. Yeah.
It's really, there was some discussion last year that I found very troubling, and because of my position at the agency, I had to bite my tongue for most of it. But
Yes, Locomotion was invited to a few of those, and for example, they casually dropped not allowing children to ride by themselves and always be with a parent, things like that. So it's worth paying attention. And if you happen to have a senator on the transportation committee, I would write to them if you are a bike supporter. Jeff has a hand up, Jonathan.
Yep, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, it's my understanding that the Transportation Innovation Act that did pass last year was one of the more significant transportation bills to come out of the legislature in quite some time, because there was so much money available. Do you have ideas on what kind of issues will be implemented because of that? We haven't even gotten into what the fiscal year starts tomorrow, I think, right? So do we have ideas on what that money and those issues that were made it through that process are going to do relative to these issues?
yeah, that's a great question. I know that, yeah, that would take some analysis, and I have not done that. I know that there is, the capital program shows a lot of spending on bike and pedestrian infrastructure. Now, a lot of that is because we are building out the Lamoille Valley Rail Trail. And that's going to be getting paid for partly in this next state fiscal year. So that's in there. There's also like a pilot program to support municipal bike and ped network plans with support from the regional planning commissions. That is in there. That's funded. Yeah, I haven't, done a close look to sort of see. It's hard to parse out exactly, like, we definitely spend more on biking and walking infrastructure than is just shown in the bike and pedestrian line item. Because we do things like put sidewalks on bridges. We do a lot of road shoulder paving. We support public transit. So we have done that in the past where we've tried to quantify that. And we may very well do that in anticipation of the next legislative session, because that topic did come up. And I think we want to go there prepared with that information, but
There was one thing John didn't cover there, which was a requirement for VTrans to start updating its state design standards for roadways, which is a document that it's pretty old at this point, and it basically governs standards for how wide lanes are, how wide shoulders are, and can be expanded, I think, to include a lot more in terms of smart growth and guidance for design of bike and pedestrian facilities and where those facilities need to be included. So what was included in the legislation for this year is that VTrans needs to make a plan for updating the standards, and then the standard will be updated, FY24 or somewhere after that. So that is exciting, and it is something that could potentially have a significant impact.
Thank you. Yeah, getting those standards updated is going to make a meaningful difference, I think, on our roadways, for sure. All right. Anyone else have any questions before we end early? We wanted to give a buffer just in case discussion got lively, but we had a quite lively discussion already. So anyone else?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any hands. I did just put a link in the chat to a blog post that we put up last week or the week before that covers some of what was in the 2022 legislation for walking and biking and transit.
Yeah. Thank you. And we'll send out a follow-up email to participants of this meeting to see who might be interested in engaging with us as we try and bring attention to the Idaho Stop law and some other projects. So I want to thank all of you for attending and your amazing, thoughtful questions and feedback and perspectives. This was a really great conversation. Thank you.
yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks to Local Motion for putting this together.
Great. All right, I think we will sign off.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.